Now, am I allowed to touch you? Daniel, a frontier man who had lost everything, whispered as his calloused fingertip brushed the tear-streaked cheek of Serena. She, a black woman once forced into marriage as if she were a debt to be paid, now stood as his wife by a cold contract. Yet in this moment, with the thin, wet fabric clinging to her skin, every curve revealed in the wavering glow of a kerosene lamp, she was no longer a burden. She was the fire that stole his breath. Serena had once warned him that only when she allowed it could he ever reach for her. And now her gaze, defiant yet burning, was the permission itself. Daniel's hand trembled, her breath quickened. Just one more heartbeat, and the distance would vanish, carrying them into a place from which there would be no return. The Wyoming sun blazed over miles of cracked earth, the wind carrying dry red dust that scraped through sagging fences. Daniel Harper's ranch, kept by a widower of 35, was haunted by nothing but the creak of old wood and the cry of crows somewhere above. 3 years had passed since fever carried off his wife, leaving behind a house turned into a silent sentence he endured each day. Broken cornstalks, cattle little more than bone and hide, and a cold bed where one pillow never bore warmth, all of it bound tight around his heart like wire. Daniel knew he could not keep on this way. Land needed hands, and a life needed presence. If not love, then at least someone beside him. In his coat pocket lay the letter, now creased and worn. He had sent it 2 weeks ago, plain as dried earth, stripped of romance. A request for a woman, practical, steady, willing to work, asking for nothing more than a roof and the grit to weather this land. No more, no less. When the stage rolled into Whetstone Ridge, dust rose thick. Daniel tightened his reins, chest heaving like a rocky slope. The letter had gone. The reply had come, and today the woman would step down from that coach, a remedy for his emptiness, or another trial he dared not name. The long whistle echoed. The coach rocked to a halt before the station. Townsfolk gathered, some leaning on saloon posts, others pretending at business near the mercantile yet keeping their eyes on the stop. Everyone knew Harper, the brooding man on the outskirts, had bought himself a mail-order bride. The door swung open. A slender hand in leather glove appeared first, then the figure of a young woman. Serena Ellis stepped down, dark eyes fixed ahead beneath the brim of a simple bonnet. The late sun caught her face, bringing out the smooth brown of her skin against the red dust of the west. Daniel froze. His heart stumbled in its beat. He had expected a worn, gaunt woman beaten down by circumstance. Instead, before him stood 27 years of poise, shoulders squared, walking as if the earth itself made way. She was beautiful, not in a fragile way, but with a strength that carried mystery. Their eyes met. Daniel, used to hiding behind his roughness, found himself unsettled enough to glance aside. He reached out, intending a firm handshake, a business formality. Yet when his calloused hand touched her gloved one, the stiffness gave way. Her grip was steady, warm, unshaken. "Mr. Harper?" Her voice was even and calm, yet it struck the silence like a hammer on iron. "Yes. And you're Serena Ellis?" His own voice rasped, drier than usual. "I am." She nodded without pause. "The agency said you needed a wife, not a servant." The street fell still. Beatrice Kettleman, who kept the mercantile, and Micah Darnell, the blacksmith, both stilled in their tracks, watching. Daniel felt their eyes burning his back. He only managed a nod, then bent to lift her trunk. Its smallness startled him, too, little for a whole new life. "That's all?" The words slipped out. "Only what matters." Her gaze cast far, as though the answer carried weight he could not yet see. The stage creaked away, leaving them ringed in the hush of the town. From the jailhouse porch, Marshal Crowe narrowed his eyes. Micah's glance lingered too long on Serena, long enough that Daniel felt a flicker of heat stir in his chest, one he did not fully understand. He set the trunk on his wagon, offering his hand to help her up. When his fingers brushed her sleeve, the fabric carried a warmth he had not expected. She did not pull away. The touch lasted but a second, yet he withdrew quicker than usual, as if caught in some trespass. The road home stretched quiet, wheels grinding over stone. Daniel stole looks at her. She showed no fear, no dismay at the barren land. Her eyes searched the cracked fields with genuine interest. "This land is harsh," Serena spoke at last, gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it is honest. It promises nothing but itself. Only those strong enough can hold a place here." Daniel tightened the reins. He was not used to hearing a woman speak of land with such resolve. In her, he glimpsed a force far beyond what he had imagined. By evening, the ranch came into view. A sagging roofline, dry grass around the barn, smoke faint from a soot-black chimney. Shame pricked him as he saw the clutter. Tools scattered on the porch, dishes unwashed by the well, a coat left to weather. 3 years of living as a shadow laid bare. He lifted her trunk down, meaning to lead her inside. But when he looked at her again, he faltered. There was no trace of disappointment in her face. She saw the broken place, but her eyes shone as if they were fixed on a beginning, not an end. And in that instant, Daniel understood. He had asked for someone ordinary, practical. Yet the woman before him was something else entirely. Serena Ellis was no mere answer. She was a variable, and from the moment their eyes had met, that variable had stirred a fear within him. The fear of passion he thought long buried, now waking again. The cabin door groaned on its hinges, opening with a weary cry. A thin swirl of dust rose in the twilight, drifting across the cramped space inside. Serena paused at the threshold, her hand still on the handle of her trunk. Her dark eyes moved slowly over the room, taking in the scene, heavy, airless, touched with sorrow. A rough-hewn table with only one chair, a stove cold with gray ash. On the shelf, a few empty bottles catching the last of the fading light. Daniel Harper stood behind her, pressing down a sigh. He had never noticed how empty his home was until another pair of eyes looked upon it. "Just haven't had time to set things straight," he muttered, his voice rough, the excuse brittle under Serena's steady, quiet gaze. She gave no reply. Instead, her steps sounded firm on the wooden floor, each one echoing as though stirring shadows that had lain undisturbed for 3 years. Above the hearth hung a daguerreotype, a young woman in a simple wedding dress, her faint smile softened further by the haze of time. Serena stopped before it, her gaze fixed. She needed no name. She knew at once this was his late wife. Daniel felt the weight of her silence pressing into the old wound. His chest tightened, his hand curling as though she might ask, might force him to speak the name he still whispered in lonely nights. But Serena asked nothing. She tilted her head, then let her eyes drift onward. That silence unsettled him more than questions ever could. He bent quickly, dragging her trunk to a corner. The motion sent a stack of wooden crates clattering. A tin can rolled across the floor. Serena knelt to retrieve it, her gloved hand brushing his rough one. The touch lasted a breath, a meeting of calloused strength and quiet grace, but it froze them both. Daniel pulled back at once, eyes avoiding hers. Serena's face stayed calm, only the faintest curve of her lips betraying what she had glimpsed in him. "I'll take care of it," he stammered, fumbling to gather the scattered things like a man caught in fault. She placed a cracked ceramic jar upright on the shelf. "This place, it isn't only untidy," she said softly. "Something remains here." Daniel looked up. Her eyes held no accusation, no pity, only the certainty of someone who had seen. He swallowed hard, turning away, busying his hands with the crates. He opened a narrow door. "This room used to store supplies. I'll clear it for you tonight. Tomorrow it will be in better order." His voice sharpened, as if distance could guard him. Serena followed. The small room carried dust on the window, light falling in thin strips. Stacked grain barrels crowded one side, old boxes another. On a low shelf lingered traces of a woman's life. An unfinished embroidered handkerchief, a pair of small shoes. Martha's remnants. Daniel's hands shook as he gathered them. He tucked the handkerchief into a box, meaning to hide it, but Serena had already seen. No words. Passed. Just a glance. He wanted to explain, to confess that he had lacked the strength to throw the past away. But his throat closed. Serena brushed her hand along the table edge, dust clinging to her fingertip. "I'll help with the cleaning," she said simply. The words were light as air, yet they struck something hollow in his chest. For 3 years, no one had crossed this threshold, let alone offered to share the quiet burden. Daniel set the box down and sank into a chair, his back bent under years he had carried alone. Serena stepped to the window, sweeping dust from the frame, tugging at the torn curtain so the evening sun spilled in. The light caught her face, her dark skin aglow, her eyes deep with something he could not name. He realized he was staring. When she turned, their eyes met, no longer the eyes of strangers. His heart jolted, his breath caught. He rose too quickly, brushing dust from his shirt. "This room is too cluttered. You'll stay in mine tonight. I'll take the porch. Tomorrow, when it's cleared, you can move in." She nodded, offering no protest. Setting her trunk against the wall, her hand brushed the old handkerchief still on the shelf. A touch so gentle, it felt like respect for the woman who had come before. Daniel watched, unsure if what he saw was mercy or another kind of strength. Outside, the sun slipped behind the mountains, shadows stretching long over the roof. Inside the cabin, dusted corners stirred to life. The scrape of crates moving, the soft swish of cloth on wood. And within those small sounds, something shifted. The silence that had ruled for 3 years was broken. That night, the cabin lay still after a long day. Serena stepped into the room that once belonged to Daniel and sat on the edge of the bed. The scent of old timber and cold ash lingered, the weak flame of the oil lamp casting her face in a light both strange and familiar. Daniel spread a thin blanket across the wooden floor, placing a worn pillow there with stiff but deliberate motions. He would not have her lying in the dust-filled room, and he would not force comfort upon her either. "Get some rest," he said quietly, turning his back. I'll take the floor. Serena inclined her head, then lay down on the bed that had long gone cold. Daniel settled on the hard boards, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, the groan of beams above, a song he had known for years. In that moment, the cabin no longer felt only like a tomb for memory, but like a place waiting to be lived in again. Good night, he murmured, rough but honest. The blanket rustled. Serena sat upright, her shadow sharp against the wall in the wavering light. Daniel lifted his gaze to meet hers, dark eyes gleaming with a steady fire. There are things I must make clear before we begin this life together, she said, her voice calm, unyielding. I will take your name, live under this roof, and work beside you. But there will be time before I share your bed. And she pulled back her sleeve, her hand resting firm on her arm. I will need a sum of my own, a portion of the ranch's profit, money that is mine to save or spend as I see fit. The lamplight caught the lines of her sun-browned arm, the small veins drawn down to her wrist. Daniel froze. He had expected a woman to be soft, cautious. Yet here was one strong enough to set her own terms without flinching. Your own money, he repeated, his voice edged with surprise and wariness. He had never thought of sharing the ranch's earnings with anyone but himself. What need has a wife for such a claim in this country? Serena kept her spine straight, her eyes locked on him. I did not leave my home, cross half the nation, only to become the property of another man. However small, I must have some independence. Daniel swallowed hard. Inside him churned astonishment and something close to respect. He was not used to such plain speaking, yet her gaze allowed no dismissal. The blanket on the floor felt suddenly out of place. He saw himself, a man who had drifted in silence for 3 years, now confronted by a woman who would not accept the role of filling emptiness. Serena Ellis had not come here to be a quiet shadow. She had come to claim her place. Daniel turned aside, hiding his unease. But in that moment he knew this marriage would be nothing like what he had imagined. Morning light spilled gold across the barren prairie. Daniel led Serena behind the cabin to what had once been a garden. Now only cracked rows of earth remained, weeds pressing through the husks of withered corn. He lifted his hand, a little uneasy. Martha used to tend this after she passed. His words faltered, his eyes fixed on the leaning fence. Serena said nothing. She crouched, fingers scraping the dry soil. Her eyes narrowed against the sun, her voice steady. This ground isn't dead. It's only thirsty. Dig a channel from the creek, and I'll plant again. Beans, squash, crops that don't wither easy, and sunflowers to cast shade. Daniel blinked. He had thought himself the one who understood land, yet he had never heard a woman speak of it so plain, so sure. You know farming? My father worked the fields of an estate. I learned more than the kitchen, she answered, the faintest smile tugging her lips as though daring his doubt. All morning they worked. Daniel hammered new boards into the fence while Serena cleared weeds, breaking the soil loose. As the sun climbed, sweat gathered at her brow, trailing thin lines down her neck, catching the light. Daniel's gaze lingered longer than it should. He fumbled for his handkerchief, stepped forward, and before she could react, pressed the cloth gently against her damp skin. The moment stilled them both. She turned her face slightly, eyes locking on his. Dark depths met pale weariness, holding longer than courtesy allowed. Daniel felt his heart stumble. Serena did not turn away. He withdrew quickly, clearing his throat. Just didn't want you catching sun fever. Her lips curved in a small, guarded smile before she bent back to her task. Yet Daniel knew something had shifted. A small thing, but enough to change the air between them. By late afternoon, Daniel saddled his horse for town. Serena stood in the doorway, her brown dress faded and dusted from the garden. He looked her over and exhaled. "You'll need a proper gown." At least for the wedding, the words caught her still. Not for the wedding itself, but because he had spoken of it. Proof he saw her not merely as a hand to fill the silence. "Come," Daniel said, extending his hand. Serena hesitated, then stepped forward. Whetstone Ridge buzzed with voices, hooves, and the smell of coal smoke from the smithy. As Daniel led her into Mrs. Santos's dress shop, eyes turned. A few men whistled low, women whispered behind paper fans. Beatrice Kettleman, the grocer's wife, called from her doorway, her voice sharp with meaning. "Well, well." The widower Harper finally opens his heart. Strange, though. Plenty of white women around. Why choose a colored girl? The murmurs swelled. Daniel's jaw locked. He feared Serena's hurt, but she did not shrink. She drew herself tall, stepping forward with a voice clear and unshaken. "I did not come to be chosen by the shade of my skin. I came because I can stand beside a man others would leave to solitude. If that seems strange to you, then take today as proof of something you never dared believe possible." Silence spread for a beat. Beatrice flushed, tongue-tied, while a few men laughed awkwardly to cover themselves. Daniel glanced at Serena, pride and a deeper stirring rising inside him. Mrs. Santos clapped her hands, breaking the tension. "She speaks true. Now, child, come let me measure you. No bride of mine will wear rags to her wedding." Serena stepped inside, leaving the whispers behind. Daniel followed with his eyes, pulse quickening. She did not need his words as shield. She stood on her own, proud and unbent, and that made him want to stand with her all the more. By the time the sun dropped behind the distant ridge, they turned homeward. Serena rode behind him, her hand resting lightly on the worn saddle for balance. The space between them was small, yet her warmth pressed close. In the crimson light of dusk, Daniel stole a glance back. Serena's eyes remained calm, but he swore he caught a glimmer there. Something unbroken. Something that refused to let the past dictate her worth. And for the first time in years, Daniel Harper knew his heart still held room for a beginning. That afternoon, the Wyoming sky turned to heavy lead. Black clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind carried the damp smell of soil, and the dry grass whispered like a warning. Daniel stood on the porch, eyes lifted, then turned to Serena. "A hard storm's coming. We need the fence shored up, or the herd will scatter." Serena nodded, tied back her hair, and pulled on her gloves. Without a trace of fear, she followed him into the fields. Hammer strikes on posts and the roar of wind mingled together, a tense music before the storm broke. Daniel drove stakes and tightened wire while Serena lifted heavy rails into place. The gusts whipped her skirt tight around her legs, yet she pressed on without falter. He watched her with a quiet awe, a woman from the east, slight in frame, refusing to yield before the West's harshness. While stretching the wire, Serena caught her foot on a buried stone and fell hard to her knees. Daniel dropped his hammer at once, rushing to her side. He caught her beneath the arm and lifted. But when she stood, her face pinched in pain, her hand gripping her leg. "My ankle. It gave," she gasped, sweat streaking her temple. Daniel did not pause. He bent, swept her into his arms, and carried her up from the dirt. Serena startled, but did not resist. The space between them shrank, filled with the heat of breath, the scent of timber and sweat. Their eyes found each other's. For that brief beat, the wind and thunder were gone. Only the hammering of two hearts remained. He carried her swiftly back to the cabin, arms clamped tight as though she might slip away. He set her on the long bench in the main room, his gaze never leaving her face. Serena leaned back, her injured foot trembling. "Let me see," Daniel said, voice low, kneeling before her. His hands cupped her ankle, turning it gently. Serena bit her lip against the pain but did not pull away. His fingers traced over sun-browned skin beneath thin fabric, warmth seeping into his calloused touch. He steadied, realigned, his pulse thundering as though it ran from his chest into his hands. Serena's eyes stayed on him, unblinking, and the moment almost stripped them of its purpose. At last, he bound her ankle with a strip of clean cloth. "It'll hold. Rest tonight, and you'll mend by morning," she nodded, exhaling. "Thank you." Daniel rose, meaning to step away, but Serena caught his wrist. The grip was light, yet enough to stop him. She met his eyes and whispered, "Stay." Outside, the first drops drummed on the tin roof, quickening to a hard downpour. Wind shrieked through the cracks. The fire snapped and spit in the hearth. Daniel lowered himself beside her, their shoulders near, warmth spreading in the small room. Serena's eyes turned to the flames. "My father used to say storms don't only destroy. They sweep away what's rotten, making space for something new." Daniel listened, still as stone. "He was the only one who believed I could be more than a cook in someone's kitchen," she went on. "But he died young. Since then, I've had to stand on my own. It isn't easy, not for a woman like me in a world that rarely opens its hands." Her voice caught, but her gaze stayed firm. Daniel saw in it not only sorrow, but a strength that cut deeper. He wanted to answer, yet words snagged in his throat. Instead, he laid his rough hand gently across hers. Serena did not pull back. They sat that way, the silence filled by rain beating its rhythm beyond the walls. The fire's glow threw their shadows long, one widower bound by memory, one woman scarred by the world, sitting close, finding a new rhythm together. And that night, while the prairie howled under storm, inside the small cabin, two hearts began to align, not with vows, not with noise, but with eyes steady and a silence that carried trust. Thunder split the sky, wind screamed through the seams of the cabin, and rain fell in torrents across the parched prairie. The cabin shook with every gust, but it was the barn that demanded their fear. Daniel and Serena did not stop to weigh choices. They threw on coats and plunged into the white blur of rain. The herd, panicked by lightning, pressed against the fence, hooves churning mud, horns clashing. Horses reared and kicked against the wooden planks. Daniel shouted over the gale, "Left side, hold it shut." Serena braced herself, both hands clamped to the door that the wind tried to rip free. Her hair, soaked and tangled, clung to her cheeks. her thin coat plastered to her body. Daniel pushed in beside her, shoulder to shoulder, straining until the latch caught. Their breath mingled in the storm's fury, the air thick with rain, soil, and hay. Inside they worked in feverish rhythm, guiding wild-eyed horses back to their stalls, steadying them with calm hands, voices meant to soothe. Serena dropped to her knees beside a shivering calf, stroking its back with quiet murmurs. Daniel glanced at her and felt something pierce deep in his chest, admiration tangled with a hunger he had kept buried. When at last the chaos subsided, they collapsed onto a pile of straw in the corner. Rain still battered the barn, but around them lingered the warmth of survival. Daniel turned. The lamplight threw Serena's outline across the wall, her dress soaked through, clinging to the lines of her body, water sliding down the ridge of her collarbone. He swallowed hard, pulse racing. His hand rose of its own accord, brushing a wet strand from her cheek. She flinched, but did not turn away. Her dark eyes locked on his, steady, questioning, daring. His voice rasped low, nearly lost in the storm. "Now, am I allowed to touch you?" The silence held, filled only by rain thrashing against the roof. Serena answered without words. She tilted her head slightly, letting his hand slide down to her chin. Their eyes bound tight, then broke into a kiss, tentative at first, trembling, then surging with a force fiercer than the storm outside. Breath quickened, hearts thundered. Serena's arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers shaking yet determined, drawing him closer until no space remained. Daniel pulled her against him, his rough hands traveling her back, holding as though she might be torn from him if he loosened his grip. Her spine pressed into the cold timber wall, the scent of pine sap seeping from it, clashing with the heat pouring off his body. Through the soaked fabric, every heartbeat, every breath pounded against her, sweeping her into the flood of his need. Her cloak slipped from her shoulders, crumpling into the straw with a hushed crackle. The lamp's flicker washed her skin in gold, beads of rain glistening like tiny pearls. Light slid across the scars and calluses on his arms, marks carved by years of labor and loss. Nothing was hidden now. Two lives, raw and uneven, met without pretense. Outside, lightning roared, but within his arms the storm seemed hushed. Their kiss deepened, urgent, releasing loneliness long carried, craving too long denied. Daniel trembled, not from chill, but from surrendering a heart he had sworn shut after grief took all. Serena wept quietly in his embrace, not weakness, but the breaking open of years spent fighting alone. For the first time, her burden had a place to rest. In the rush of rain, the pounding of hearts, they gave to each other not only flesh, but grief, trust, and solace. That night, inside a barn rattling against the storm, a new home was forged, not from timber and stone, but from the binding of two battered souls. After passion's fire ebbed, they lay tangled in the straw, breaths still uneven. Daniel pulled an old blanket over them, then wrapped her close to his chest. Outside, the storm raged unbroken, but in his arms Serena found peace. Her voice, ragged yet certain, rose against the storm. "Perhaps this is where I was meant to belong." Daniel gave no answer. He only tightened his hold, closed his eyes, and let the rain and wind sing their wild lullaby. Morning broke weakly after the storm. The ground lay soaked, puddles of mud glinting with the pale wash of dawn. Daniel stepped onto the porch, the air heavy with damp earth and hay. In the barn, the horses settled, chewing quietly on straw. Inside the cabin, Serena stood at the window, her curls loose from the long night, her eyes still shadowed with the rest she had not found. They spoke little. Something had shifted between them during the storm, a bond invisible yet binding. Daniel was turning back inside to fix breakfast when hoofbeats rang out through the mist. A rider emerged from the thinning fog, broad hat, upright in the saddle. "Marshal Crowe," Daniel muttered, eyes narrowing. The old lawman and reined in slow, his weathered face set beneath the brim beaded with dew. He halted at the porch, his murky brown eyes probing deep. "Daniel." Miss Ellis Crowe tipped his head, then drew a folded slip from his coat, the edges damp. "Telegram came through from Boston." "Figured you best see it now." Serena stiffened, her fingers clenching at her skirt. The thin paper trembled like a blade when Daniel took it. The words were few, but enough to freeze the air. "Searching for Serena Ellis. Winford family debt unsettled. Legal guardian, Philip Uldren. Report immediately." Daniel's jaw locked. He could not untangle the laws of the East, but every line stank of power, cold as shackles. Serena sank into a wooden chair, her dark eyes clouded with sudden dread. Crowe studied her. "This name, Philip Uldren. Who is he?" Serena did not answer. Her hand rose, trembling, covering her left wrist, where a faded scar ran thin. Daniel saw the gesture, saw the fear pressed beneath it. He stepped close, set his rough hand over hers. "Serena," he said low, steady, "tell me." She lifted her eyes, wet but fierce, a smile tugging faint at her trembling mouth. "He was never my husband, but he was the shadow laid over my life." Her voice faltered. Daniel sat beside her, his thumb rubbing calm across her knuckles, that small touch pulling her back from the dark. "My father." She drew a sharp breath. "He gambled. Lost everything. When there was nothing left to pay, he gave me, like coin, like cattle, to buy himself free. A paper of betrothal, a handshake. And tears slid down her cheek. I was never asked what I wanted. Uldren called it protection. I called it chains, the cabin hushed, only the wind threading through the cracks. Crowe's brow furrowed, his tone even yet warning. He's a man of means. Money twists the law when it wishes. If his reach found its way to Wyoming, he won't give easy. Daniel felt Serena's grip tighten on his hand, clutching as if drowning. He turned, his gaze hard as stone. She belongs to no man. She is Serena Ellis, and she is my wife. Crowe looked at them both, something softening in his tired eyes. He pressed his hat to his chest and nodded once. I'll hold what ground I can within the law. But you'd best be ready. When gold speaks, justice often grows deaf. He touched spur to flank, horse splashing through the wet earth as he rode off into the gray. Inside, Serena sat still, her hand locked in Daniel's. Outside, dark clouds gathered again on the far horizon, promising another storm. Daniel squeezed her hand, voice sure as bedrock. Look at me. She raised her eyes. No matter your past, no matter his power, here, this place, you have me, and I won't let anyone drag you back. Her tears fell, this time not from fear, but from trust. In his eyes, she found what life had denied her, a vow without paper, without seal, only his hand wrapped tight around hers, warm and unyielding as stone. Beyond the walls, the wind carried the scent of rain once more. But inside the cabin, where their hands were fastened, a different storm had broken and passed. The sun sank behind the mountains, leaving a scarlet wound stretched across the horizon. Darkness slid over the prairie faster than usual, heavy as a wet blanket smothering grass and soil still sodden from the earlier storm. Daniel stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the dim road. He knew the shadow of Boston no longer lived only on a telegram. It had taken shape in hooves and men, and they were drawing closer. Inside, Serena set supper on the table, though neither touched a bite. The lamp flame wavered, her silhouette dancing against the timber wall. Daniel stepped in, laying a calloused hand on her shoulder. She turned, eyes betraying the tremor she tried to hide. "They're coming, aren't they?" Her voice was soft, but steady. Daniel nodded, words unnecessary. Rumors had already spread from town. Strangers on Eastern-bred horses, not buying, not resting, only asking about a woman named Serena Ellis. The meal cooled untouched. Daniel cleared the table quickly, then drew her out to the porch. "We have to prepare." Together they circled the ranch, testing every latch and frame. Daniel drove extra boards across the doors, stacked grain sacks beneath the windows for cover. Serena followed with the lantern, its glow shivering across her face. Her hands, once meant for sewing or stirring pots, now steadied themselves for defense. Back in the kitchen, Daniel opened an old chest. Inside lay a Winchester .73, the rifle from his roaming days on the frontier. He cleaned, loaded, every motion crisp and sure. Serena stood silent a moment, then reached forward, placing her hand atop his. Their eyes met in the flickering light. No words passed, but both knew. Tonight love was no longer a kiss or storm-bound embrace. It was a wall to be held together, a vow forged in survival. His rough hand gripped the rifle. Her firm, steady hand pressed over his. In the dark, that union was a covenant. Outside, the wind shifted. Horses in the barn stirred uneasily, neighing sharp and short. Daniel signaled, and he blew out the lamp. The cabin fell into darkness, only moonlight streaking silver through the cracks in the walls. They sat shoulder to shoulder by the window, ears straining for sound. Faint hoofbeats carried first like stray heartbeats, then grew clearer, closer, like the steady pulse of a predator. Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. Serena kept her hand atop his, her fingers trembling, yet her breath measured. "You don't stand alone anymore," she whispered. Daniel turned. For a heartbeat he saw it in her eyes, a strength rising beyond fear, a trust placed in him, in them both. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere beyond the fence. Silence followed, so deep he could hear Serena's breath, hear his own heartbeat hammering. Darkness pressed against the cabin like a weight ready to crush. Then 3 knocks, slow, cold. Serena shuddered but did not release his hand. Daniel narrowed his eyes, drawing her back behind the barricade. A man's voice, carried, thick and drawn out. "We only want to talk. Open the door and no harm comes." Daniel stayed quiet. Serena pressed her lips tight, anchoring her hand on his. Outside, shadows shifted. Leather creaked. Steel whispered faint against steel. Daniel leaned close, murmured into her ear, "They want you, Serena." but they will not have you." She nodded, tears glinting in the dark. "If not for you, I'd have run again. But now," she squeezed his hand, "now I stay." To the end, the night dragged on. The men outside did not leave. They lingered, patient as wolves at the edge of firelight, waiting for weakness. Inside, the two held close, sharing the taut silence. Every brush of fingers, every glance in the gloom bound them tighter. The old clock, Martha's clock, ticked slow, marking each breath of survival. Every chime was proof. They still lived, still endured, together. At last, the call of a prairie rooster broke the night. Dawn bled pale over the land, and the hoofbeats receded into the distance. Serena exhaled, her body loosening at last. Daniel set the rifle down, though his hand did not release hers. In the gray wash of morning, they sat there, drained yet unbroken. The wolves had retreated for now, but in their hearts, a truth had taken root. Love was no longer a fragile dream. It had become strength, strength enough to stand, to protect, to endure against the darkness pressing in. The summer fair arrived just as the prairie dried from a hard rain. The dirt road into Whetstone Ridge still held puddles that mirrored the rare, clear sky. Townsfolk set long tables in front of the church, laid out pies, roasted chicken, and jugs of fresh cider. Children shrieked with laughter, darting beneath strings of bright paper flags that seemed to sweep away the gloom of storms past. Serena walked beside Daniel, his hand brushing lightly at her back in quiet assurance. She wore a dress of soft green, stitched in haste by the town seamstress, but fitted well, flattering her slender frame and sun-browned skin. Her hair was braided close, with a few curls left to fall against her cheeks. Eyes turned as she passed. No longer only the curious or doubtful glances of her first days here. There was recognition now, even respect. She was becoming part of this frontier community. Daniel felt his heart beat quicker at the sight of her in that dress. He remembered the storm, her hand in his, and knew that today, before all gathered, they stood as one. A banjo struck up in the corner of the yard, a cowboy's tune lifting the crowd. Serena smiled, shy but warm, as a few women came to greet her. Daniel was steering her toward the laden tables when the sound of hooves shattered the music. Fast, pounding, urgent. Not the gait of festival guests, but of a storm bearing down. All eyes swung as 6 riders on black horses swept into the square. At their head rode a man in a black suit gleaming with gold-stitched trim, boots polished to mirror the sun. He sat straight-backed, his face cut sharp, his eyes glacial. Behind him trailed a gaunt lawyer, clutching a rolled parchment, out of place among the frontier folk. The music died. Children pressed to their mothers' skirts. Silence thickened. Daniel pulled Serena behind him, his gaze locked. "Forgive the interruption," the man intoned, voice smooth but proud. "My name is Philip Uldren. I have come to reclaim what is mine," he signaled. The lawyer stepped forward, unrolling the parchment, voice carrying. "A marriage contract, signed by Mr. Joseph Ellis of Boston, father to Serena. Ellis binding her to Philip Uldren in settlement of gambling debts, duly notarized under Massachusetts law. By its terms, Serena is the lawful betrothed of Mr. Uldren." The words fell heavy, stirring murmurs through the crowd. Some shook their heads, others cast pitying looks toward Serena. She stood tall, face pale yet shoulders unbowed. Daniel felt her tremble beneath his hand, but her eyes burned with pride. Uldren dismounted, his polished shoes striking wet earth without stain. His gaze swept the townsfolk before fixing on Serena. You ran far, Serena, but paper holds weight. You are bound. You are mine, Daniel stepped forward, voice rough, resolute. She belongs to no man. She is my wife, wed here under witness of this community. The crowd rumbled. Some nodded, some glanced uneasily at the lawyers. Parchment. Out west, choice and witness carried law, but Eastern documents bore a power hard to dismiss. Serena moved half a step forward, standing level with Daniel. Her voice rang clear, startling in its force. I am not a debt to be paid. I am not property to be traded. I am Serena Ellis, and today I choose to stand here with this man. Her words cut the air. The square held still. Beatrice Kettleman, once quick to gossip, pressed a hand to her lips, eyes strangely bright. A murmur rose, agreement, then clapping, faint at first, swelling until it rolled across the crowd. Uldren's fist clenched, his face twisting before he smoothed it again. You think applause overrules law? I have paper, I have witnesses, I have wealth. From the edge of the square, Marshal Crowe stepped forward, hand resting on his revolver. His voice carried, heavy with iron. You may have those things, but in Whetstone Ridge, we have truth. And the truth is, this woman stands free, unforced, before every soul here. The crowd stirred, nodding, voices rising. The tide was shifting. Uldren sneered, tilting his head in signal. His 6 men tightened reins, hands resting on pistols. The air grew taut, brittle as glass. Daniel reached behind him, found Serena's hand. She slid her fingers into his, grip fierce, steady. In that small square, before the eyes of neighbors and strangers, a line had been drawn. Bow to the weight of paper and power from the East, or stand firm on truth and the love they claimed as their own. The church of Whetstone Ridge had never held so many souls. People pressed shoulder to shoulder on the wooden pews, lined the aisles, crowded outside windows just to hear. The air was close, heavy as if the place itself had turned into a courthouse without name. At the front, before the altar, Serena and Daniel stood side by side. Facing them, Philip Uldren and his suited lawyer wore expressions of arrogance, as though victory were already theirs. Marshal Crowe, silver star gleaming on his chest, stood between them, his voice carrying like iron through the rafters. Today, both sides will be heard, and justice shall not belong to Boston nor Wyoming alone, but to truth itself. Uldren strode forward, thrusting a parchment into Crowe's hands, his tone clipped with confidence. Black ink on white hide, notarized, witnessed. Debt paid through a betrothal, all legal, none here can deny it. The crowd murmured. Some nodded, uneasy. Others frowned, restless. Daniel's grip tightened on Serena's hand. He was about to speak when Serena stepped forward instead, her eyes burning with a light they had never seen before. You want proof? Her voice trembled, but rang clear. Slowly, she drew up her sleeve, baring her left wrist. A scar ran there, long, thin, faded but deep. The church fell silent. Women covered their mouths, men stiffened with a shudder. Serena held their eyes. This is the price I bore, a life treated as coin to settle a debt. I was never asked. I never consented. You call it marriage. I call it chains. The hush cracked. Beatrice Kettleman, once the sharpest tongue in town, suddenly rose, voice sharp as a bell. She speaks the truth. I lived in Boston once. I saw her father dragged from the tables by Uldren's men. I remember him boasting he would take the daughter in place of money. If need be, I'll swear it before any court. The church erupted. Doubt turned to sympathy, whispers to conviction. Marshall stepped forward, his tone cutting. This shows that so-called contract was no covenant freely made, but one born of coercion. By law, any bond lacking consent is void. Uldren's face drained of color. His lawyer sputtered, "That is hearsay. No written affidavit." "Affidavit!" Crow's voice struck like steel. "Here we have the whole of this community as witness." And a scar speaks louder than any paper applause burst, scattered at first, then swelling into thunder that shook the rafters. Farmers, wives, children, every eye turned toward Serena now with respect. No longer an outsider, one of their own. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but firm enough to reach every corner. She is not a thing to barter. She is Serena Ellis, and from the day she set foot here, I have chosen. I chose her as my wife. He lifted her hand high, their fingers bound in the thick air of sweat, wood, and long-held tension, at last breaking. His eyes roved over the gathered faces, marking each with the truth. Serena looked at him, her eyes shining with tears, her smile breaking open. For the first time, she felt the past had no power over her. Uldren spun on his heel, rage flashing before he masked it. The crowd parted, giving him space, yet no voice offered him comfort. Their silence was its own verdict. In this frontier town, his Eastern gold and papers had no hold. Marshall folded his arms, voice flat. "Mr. Uldren, I advise you to leave." Now Uldren ground his teeth, swept his coat, and signaled. His riders followed, hooves hammering, leaving nothing but dust. Inside the church, relief broke loose. Beatrice clasped Serena's hand, whispering, "Stronger than we ever knew." Neighbors pressed close, clapping Daniel's shoulders, touching Serena with pride. She belonged. Daniel leaned near, murmuring where only she could hear. "All my life I was never sure. Except of this, you are my wife." She laughed through her tears, her eyes alight. And as the church bells tolled, Whetstone Ridge bore witness to a truth no paper could undo. Love had prevailed. That morning the prairie lay bathed in warm gold. Sunlight stretched across the wheat fields heavy with heads. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and the faint tang of dry straw. After many days of turmoil, Whetstone Ridge fell quiet, as if to hold a proper reverence for a day unlike any before it. The day Serena Ellis and Daniel Hayes would be married. The little wooden church wore garlands of wildflowers gathered from the valley. Yellow, purple, and white blooms braided together, plain and bright. People had gathered since dawn, each bearing a simple gift: a basket of apples, a baked pie, an embroidered handkerchief. They had little wealth, but their full attendance and warm smiles were the greatest blessing for a couple who had endured so much. Serena stood in the small room behind the church. Her wedding dress, cut from plain white cloth, had been sewn in haste by the town women working together. Mrs. Henderson stitched the sleeve seams. Little Ruthie tucked sprigs of lavender into her hair. When Serena peered into the old, dim mirror, she saw a different light in her eyes. No longer the look of a woman fleeing, but the steady gaze of one who had chosen where she belonged. Outside, Daniel waited at the altar. He wore a simple gray suit, his white shirt a touch worn, but neatly clean. His hands trembled as he held his hat, not from nerves before the crowd, but because his heart had not felt so full in many years. After long seasons of solitude, he was about to regain a home and a hand to hold until the end. When the church bell rang, the doors swung open. Serena entered, each step slow, each step proud. Stained glass caught the light and fell across her white dress and brown skin, and many faces went still. Women dabbed their eyes. Men bowed their heads with quiet smiles. Daniel stepped forward and offered his hand. Serena placed her palm in his, warm and steady. The murmurs fell away. The minister's voice rose. Today we witness not only a marriage, but the triumph of love over chains, the triumph of truth over falsehood. Serena and Daniel, do you pledge to walk together to the end of your days, in hardship and in plenty, in sorrow and in joy? Daniel's voice was husky. I do. Serena met his eyes, bright and clear. I do. No gold rings, no elaborate papers. The simple assent and joined hands sufficed. The minister smiled and declared, Before God and the people of Whetstone Ridge, I pronounce you husband and wife. The church erupted in applause and cheers. Children leaped with delight. Neighbors embraced and offered blessings. Beatrice Kettleman, once the town's keenest gossip, rose to clap the loudest, whispering, At last, the day has come. Daniel bent and kissed Serena. There was no hesitation or lingering fear, only faith and full-hearted love. When he released her, the bell rang again, and the clapping rose with a spontaneous song from the crowd. After the ceremony, they stepped onto the church porch. People formed a long line to pass their wishes hand to hand. An old man pressed a warm pie into their hands. A young woman placed an embroidered cloth upon Serena's arm. A child slipped a four-leaf sprig into Serena's palm. Every gift was sincere. Every gift meant one thing: she would never be alone again. That afternoon, the community gathered around the long tables in the churchyard. Banjo music lifted into the open air. Daniel and Serena danced, awkward at first, but with eyes fixed only on one another. Each step became a vow. Each turn became the start of something new. Sunset poured gold over the fields. Flocks of birds angled homeward. For the first time after many years, Serena felt she had a home, not of timber and coin, but of trust and love that had passed every test. Daniel squeezed her hand and murmured over the din of celebration, At last, you are my wife. No power, no paper can change that. Serena smiled, her eyes bright. And you are my home. Autumn settled over Whetstone Ridge. Dry winds carried the scent of wild grass and fresh straw, sweeping away the last dust of a summer filled with storms. The fields before the ranch gleamed gold, rows of wheat bending gently under the mellow sun, promising a full harvest. The wooden house, once empty, dusty and silent, now shone as though reborn. Cracks on the porch had been filled. The window frames wore new curtains sewn by Serena's own hands. On the dining table, jars of wildflowers always stood bright, a reminder that new life begins in the simplest things. Serena stood on the porch, her hand resting on the wooden rail, her gaze stretching over the endless fields. The wind tugged at her dress, carrying a sense of calm. For the first time in years, Her eyes carried no shadow of fear or haunting. Only peace remained, a peace purchased with tears and courage. Behind her came the sound of familiar boots. Daniel drew near, his strong arms wrapping around her from behind. He held her close, warmth seeping into her, driving off the crisp bite of the autumn breeze. Serena tilted her head so her curls brushed his cheek, a smile softening her lips. Daniel bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. It was not the storm-driven kiss of that night in the barn, but one of shelter and steady trust. Within that tender touch lay a promise stronger than any vow. Serena lifted her hand to cover his where it circled her waist. Her fingers traced the hardened calluses and the old scars of a life worked raw. Her voice came hushed, trembling but radiant. "We truly have a home now." Daniel said nothing, only pulled her tighter. His eyes lifted to the far horizon where the sun bled into fire red, a blaze marking the rise of something new. In the distance came the laughter of children darting across the yard. Cattle grazed lazily, bells clinking in rhythm with the wind. The ranch, once filled with silence and shadows, now thrummed with the sounds of life. Serena rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing. In Daniel's arms, she knew she no longer fought alone. The pain of the past, the scars on her heart and body alike, now stood as proof of the road she had walked and of the love she had found. When the sun finally slipped below the ridge, leaving a pale purple sky, Daniel turned her to face him. His gaze searched deep into hers before he kissed her again. This time the kiss carried not only tenderness, but certainty. "You are my wife," he whispered, "and always will be." Serena smiled through tears that shone in the fading light. "And you are my home." They held each other close, as if pressing the moment into memory, to withstand any storm that might follow. And so the story closed on that weathered porch, bathed in golden sunset over the prairie, with the embrace of two hearts once thought closed forever. From a contract born of necessity, Serena and Daniel had uncovered the most precious gift, a love enduring as the hardship, western sky, gentle as autumn wind, warm as the fire in their small cabin. Perhaps many of us believe we have passed the age of beginning again, that the spring of our lives is long gone. But this tale reminds us, love is not measured by youth, but by the courage to open one's heart, no matter how late, no matter how scarred by storm. If you see a glimmer of yourself in the journey of Serena and Daniel, share your thoughts or memories of love in the comments below. We would be honored to hear them. And please don't forget to press like and subscribe so together we can continue wandering through these Wild West love stories, tales that linger not only in young hearts, but in seasoned ones still brave enough to feel.